and welcome back to the Rekindling the Legacy podcast. I am Professor Andrew Davis.
And I'm Dr. Juhi Gupta.
And together we are here today representing the Inclusive Futures Foundation. IFF is an NGO based in India. We work in a number of areas, including culture, education, healthcare, the environment, and the rights of women and children. You can find out much more about our projects there on our website, which is theinclusivefuturesfoundation.com. Do go and have a look when you've got a minute. But not now, because
today we are diving into the story of a woman who understood that empowerment begins with information, and that sometimes the most revolutionary act is simply giving women a voice.
We're talking about Uma Nehru, born in 1884, who became a pioneering force in women's journalism and activism. What makes her story particularly compelling is how she used the power of the written word to challenge an entire social order.
Uma was born on March 8th, International Women's Day, which feels wonderfully symbolic, in Agra, to Niranjan Nath Huku and Talia's Huku. She was educated at St. Mary's Convent in Hubli and was remarkably well-rounded, fluent in Hindi, English, and Urdu.
And her background at this young age was really rather charming. She played piano, she enjoyed knitting and gardening, she played badminton, that was her favourite sport. So she had plenty going on in her personal life as well. She was a complete human being with her personal interests and hobbies, not just a political figure.
In 1901, he married Shamlal Nehru, who was Jawaharlal Nehru's cousin, making her sister-in-law to India's future Prime Minister. They had a son and a daughter, and immediately after marriage, she threw herself into social work.
But her most significant contribution came in the early 20th century, when she became a regular writer and eventually editor of Sri Darpan, a magazine for women founded in 1909. Sri Darpan came at a moment when change was so desperately needed in society. Uma understood that if women couldn't physically gather, they could at least connect through the written word.
And she wasn't content with just one platform. She was also the editor of another magazine called Maryada. Through these publications, she was expressing her views on gender equality in what was an overwhelming male-dominated society.
What strikes me as being particularly courageous is that she faced backlash from both men and women. Imagine trying to advocate for women's rights when even some women were resistant to change. But she remained fearless and she continued to pursue her objectives.
Now, this gives evidence to something we see repeatedly in social reform movements. The reformer often faces opposition from the very community they're trying to help. People can become comfortable with oppression, especially when challenging it seems dangerous.
Uma also founded the All India Women's Conference in Allahabad and served as its president. This wasn't for her just about writing and publishing, she was building institutional structures for women's empowerment.
And her focus on education is particularly significant. She promoted women's education and girl child education as fundamental to female upliftment. She understood that lasting change required educational transformation.
But here's what makes Uma Nehru's story even more remarkable. While she was fighting this battle for women's rights, she was also participating fully in the independence struggle. She took part, for instance, in the Salt March and the Quit India movement.
And like so many of the women we have discussed in this series, her activism led to imprisonment by the British government. She was paying a personal price for her political conviction.
Her political engagement didn't end after independence either. She was elected to the Lok Sabha twice from Uttar Pradesh, and from 1962 to 1963, she was an active member of the Rajya Sabha.
This progression is fascinating, from magazine editor to freedom fighter to elected representative. She was living through and helping to shape the entire arc of modern Indian democracy.
She also authored books, including Mother India and Bipka in Hindi, so she was contributing to the literary landscape as well as the political one.
Uma Nehru died on August 28, 1963 in Lucknow. But then she had lived to see not just independence, but also the early years of the Republic of India, including the implementation of many of the women's rights she had advocated for decades.
Her legacy has been documented by author Pragya Pathak in a book called Uma Nehru or Striyon Ke Adhikar, Uma Nehru and Women's Rights. The book highlights the awful conditions that women faced in 20th century India and Uma's contributions to improving them.
And Andrew, what I find most significant about Uma Nehru is how she understood that change happens through multiple channels simultaneously. She wasn't just advocating for women's rights in the abstract, she was creating concrete platforms for women's voices.
Yeah, absolutely. The magazine Sri Darpan was revolutionary because it assumed that women had thoughts worth sharing, that their opinions were worth reading and their experiences worth documenting. In 1909, that was a radical assumption.
And think about the courage required to be an editor. Every issue she published was a statement about women's capabilities and rights. Every article was a challenge to the status quo.
She also had to work within the complex dynamics of the Nehru family. Being sister-in-law to Jawaharlal Nehru certainly gave her access to political circles, but it also meant that her actions reflected on one of India's most prominent political families.
And yet, she carved out her own distinct identity and agenda. She wasn't riding on family connections. She was building her own legacy of women's empowerment.
And her multilingual abilities, being able to speak Hindi, English, and Urdu fluently, also speak to her understanding that women's empowerment needed to cross linguistic and cultural boundaries. She could reach different communities in their own languages.
And her transition from social activism to electoral politics shows how the independence movement created opportunities for women who had proven themselves as leaders and organizers.
One thing that sets Uma Nehru apart from some of the other women that we've talked about and will talk about is that she did live long enough to see some of the fruits of her labour. By 1963, Indian women had the right to vote, could hold office, and had legal protections that were really unimaginable when she started Sri Darpan in 1909.
But I think her most lasting contribution might be the precedent she set, that women could and should be creators of media, shapers of public opinion, and definers of their own narrative.
And in our current era of digital media and social platforms, Uma Nehru feels remarkably contemporary. She understood that whoever controls the narrative controls the possibility of change.
And she faced the same challenges that women's rights advocates face today. Backlash from both conservative men and women who were uncomfortable with changing traditional roles.
And the fact that she had to face opposition from women as well as from men reminds us that social change is never simple. Advocates often have to be prepared for resistance from really quite unexpected quarters.
Uma Nehru showed that revolution does not always announce itself with dramatic gestures. Sometimes it starts quietly with a magazine, with women gathering to read and discuss, with the simple but radical act of saying women's voices matters.
So from piano playing to prison cells, from magazine editing to parliamentary debates, Uma Nehru lived a life that spanned the personal and political, the cultural and the legislative.
She understood that women's emancipation required multiple strategies: education, media representation, political participation, and cultural change. She worked on all these fronts simultaneously.
So that's Uma Nehru, a journalist, activist, author, parliamentarian, pioneer of women's media in India. A woman who proved that sometimes the most powerful weapon for social change is simply giving people the tools to tell their own stories.
So thank you for joining us on this episode of Rekindling the Legacy. Until next time, remember that every voice that speaks for justice builds on the courage of those who spoke before.
And that sometimes the most lasting revolutions begin not with a sword, but with a magazine and the radical belief that everyone's story deserves to be heard. If you want to hear more stories like Uma Nehru's, please do like this podcast and subscribe to the channel so you don't miss a single episode. We'll see you soon.